Welcome to the Warren Cycling Podcast. My name is Dean Warren. I'm in Sarasota, Florida today.
I'm Randy Warren, and I'm in Asheville, North Carolina.
Yeah, this is kind of the off season for the road racing that we like to talk about so much, although there's other racing going on. But today we have another interview, and we're super stoked and super excited about the guest today.
Yeah, is episode 375? Is that what we are doing?
375, and it's Friday the
375.
13th,
All right.
2024.
Well, John Kennedy Howard has held world cycling records at both ends of the spectrum of madness, speed and endurance. He's a three-time Olympian and has coached many national and international champions from Olympic gold medal fame to the grueling race across America. A cycling journalist, Howard has 5 book titles and hundreds of articles spanning every facet of cycling. But one story really drove him to right or wrong. Marshall Walter Taylor was the highest paid athlete and the most recognized athletic champion of the turn of the century, a cyclist who dominated the sport. But because he was Black in America divided by race, his amazing and courageous story was lost to obscure history. He was, in fact, the first African American to break the color barrier in sports. In his book, The Black Cyclone, A Hero of the World Forgot, John Howard brings to life Major Taylor. Researched extensively over years and through interviews with Taylor's daughter before her passing, The Black Cyclone chronicles the life and times of the man who reigned as the U.S. national champion and then world champion in 1899 and set Europe afire on the cycling circuit. And in the most exquisite historic justice, John Kennedy Howard and Marshal Major Walter Taylor entered the Cycling Hall of Fame on the very same day in 1989. John's here today to speak about the novel that he and co-author Renee Moore have woven from the actual life of Major Taylor. Well, welcome, John.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's just awesome to be able to get to talk to you. And Randy, when you referred to the turn of the century, you were speaking about from the 19th century into the 20th century, at the late 1800s, early 1900s.
We're both old enough too that our natural reference is that one, not the recent one, right? But
wow, so this is a work that's been in progress, was in progress for a long time. It must feel really good to have it finally all wrapped up and put together.
Well, finally, it's an embarrassingly long time to be writing a book, but I felt like I needed certainly Sydney Taylor Brown's full attention when I was doing the research back in the 80s. And the more I dug, the more questions I had for her. And there were times when she was just completely overwhelmed by it all, and we would have to stop the interview. But I actually flew back to Pittsburgh on several occasions to interview this amazing woman who actually was quite a good athlete herself. She was a really strong swimmer, and I'm trying to remember what else Sydney did. I think it was basketball was her sport, in spite of being about 5'4", 5'3", 5'4". She was quite a good basketball player. Her mother was an excellent swimmer, Daisy. But I think Sydney's primary focus was on basketball, and she was quite a good shooter. I remember her telling me that. But anyway, what I got from Sydney was the real story. What happened to her father, it wasn't pretty. And of course, we go into great detail about what happened to Major Taylor after he retired. But I can't tell you what a huge honor it was to be inducted into the U.S. Cycling Hall of Fame in the same year as my boyhood hero. And that was where Sydney was there to accept on behalf of her father, and I I really picked up the steam after that, and that's when I started traveling back to Pittsburgh to get, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of
rest.
the story.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because so I when I was in grad school, I actually read and did a report on Andrew Ritchie's book, the biography of Major Taylor, and then that was published in 1988, and then that's just about the time you were being inducted into the Hall of Fame. And then I also recently listened to The World's Fastest Man on audiobooks, just because I drive a lot for my cycling coaching that I do around the country, and so I was listening to that story too. So, but when you started thinking about writing the book, it was before there was really a definitive biography. I mean, I know Major Taylor wrote his own autobiography, but I understand that was really long and a little tougher read, right?
Tough to read. It was written from the world of I. Uh, he was a very strong-willed athlete, and he wrote about himself. And it is a good autobiography, but it is a bit tough to get through. I have an original copy, I'm happy to say, one of the few still out there. Um, and it is there's an abridged version that Stephen Green Press came out with that's a bit easier to read, but nevertheless, um, from that, I read it cover to cover, and then I started asking questions. And when I I knew Andrew Ritchie early on.
Mm.
He's a Brit and a wonderful, wonderful communicator. Um, and I will tell you that every one of the biographies, the last being Michael Cranish's book, The World's Fastest Man, all offered new information. Todd Balf's book, um, the Keebler's book, they were all unique in that each one revealed a new part of Major Taylor's story. So I had the advantage of using all of that original material and piecing together the rest of the story. So when I spoke with Sydney, she really filled in the rest of it, and I had an opportunity to just basically listen to her explaining all of these various facets of her father's life, what happened, the World War One deferment that he got for being a superb machinist. Um, some of the inventions that he had, things that almost nobody knows. I think probably Michael Cranish had a few minutes of time with Sydney in an assisted living home, and Peter Nye, my good friend Peter Nye, also had an opportunity to speak with Sydney. But other than that, I may well be the only person out there that's had that opportunity to speak with her. So I just want to talk a little bit more about some of the things that Major Taylor came up with, in addition to what real enthusiasts know as the outrigger stem, which allowed him to change his body position depending on the type of race, whether it was a long, like the 75-mile road race that he rode and won out from Indianapolis to Matthews, Indiana, in the mud. He raced that, and it was a stem that he developed himself, and he the first few versions, which were done in Bertie Munger's. Bertie Munger, of course, was his coach. But they were done in the factory, the Munger Bike Works in Indianapolis, and they were cast. The early ones were forged and then later cast, and the design was not universally accepted by his racing contemporaries because it was his idea. And of course, as we know, racism was a part of the culture of the times. So I don't know of any cyclist that had a lower profile than Major Taylor on his bike when he was sitting on the Ivor Johnson or the Munger Special. Was in a position that put him, I would say, substantially lower than some of the other riders. You look at Floyd McFarlane, for example, one of his contemporaries. You'll see him. Of course, Floyd was about 9 or 10 inches taller than Major Taylor, but he sits much higher on the bike, which consequently he had to produce more power in order to go the same speed. That's basically what aerodynamics are all about. Major Taylor figured it out very quickly that you want to get as low as possible to be as slippery as possible. So that was one thing that he came up with early on. Another one, after he retired, there was a big rubber shortage in World War One. All the rubber was going to the war effort in Europe. And Taylor came up with an idea. Actually, Bertie Munger had the idea first, and then Taylor developed it on his own. It was what was called the spring wheel. Cars of that era had very poor suspension systems, and tires they would patches. They would make these old tires go as far as they possibly could, and they were horribly dangerous because they would blow out frequently. But that started the recapping business, which was another of Major Taylor's endeavors later on, after some of the other things had not panned out well. But I think the spring wheel is one thing that certainly deserves some discussion. If you can imagine a circle, I've had drawings of it, but take a circle, which of course is a wheel. You have the outside um, produced and with sectional. I'm going to try to explain this as best I can. Sectional pieces of hard rubber, which were in the day, rubber lasted a lot longer than it did today because it was natural latex. A lot of it came from South America, and it was scarce. This is way before chemicals were added to the supply. So these tires, what Major did was chop up sections of tire, and there was a peg that was loaded with a radial spring attached to the hub. So each section rolled. As it rolled, it compressed on a spring. And he tested it on his Stutz Bearcat to make sure it had some performance capabilities. And he also tested it on his helper, Austin Coates pickup truck, which of course had a leaf springs suspension system. And as I say, the suspensions were really bad in those early cars. So what this spring wheel, the Taylor tire, he called it, did was soften the roadway for automobiles of the day, which, of course, about the only real hard surface roads, consistent hard surface roads of the time were in New England. And of course, Major Taylor eventually ended up in Worcester, Massachusetts, as we all know, out of Indianapolis. And that's a whole nother story. But after World War One, we have the rubber shortage. Something happened. Either the Taylor tire didn't get in the patent office quick enough, but somehow it didn't pan out. I think personally, I think it had a lot to do with he had a contract with Pierce Arrow actually, but he couldn't get the rubber that he needed or the springs that he needed in the supply that he needed to accomplish what he needed to accomplish with Pierce Arrow, which was his main contact or contractor for the wheels. So that's basically it. He lost upwards of $30,000. 20,000 of that was from his sponsor, um, who hung on with him, Fred Johnson of Ivor Johnson Arms and Cycles in Massachusetts. They were among the first. Well, they built handguns and they built bicycles. Bottom line, that's how they made their reputation strong in New England. But those actually one of those I pardon me for digressing here, but one of those pistols ended up being the murder weapon of Robert Kennedy, and another ended the life of I'm trying to remember the name of, McKinley also. So these were small handguns, very, very effective in what they were used for. So President McKinley and Robert Kennedy both were gunned down by Ivor Johnson pistols. Major Taylor and his crew carried one with them. That's how dangerous life was on the road. So, once I get rolling, I hope you're okay with this,
For sure.
guys. But I get into a role where I'm talking about subjects that I know pretty well, so I move with it. Yeah, they carried handguns with them because they never knew what was going to happen. A good example of that was Savannah, Georgia, where Major Taylor and one of his trainer went to head down there for winter training, and they got to Savannah, and they had an incident. Keep in mind that cycling in the South was immensely popular. There were tracks in Savannah. They had, I think, a wooden velodrome and possibly a paved track in Grant Park. And I've lived in Atlanta, so I know Grant Park. And these were tracks that drew thousands of people in that era. So cycling was very popular in the South. But on the occasion of Major Taylor's first arrival, of course, he wanted to get out on the road. He took his road bike out, and he was blasting along a country road 20 or so miles from the city of Savannah, and he had just arrived by train, so he was eager to cover some miles, and he got caught by a triplet. Three, these were the hot pacing crew from Savannah. They would pace cyclists, but they were not happy to see Major Taylor on their wheels. So they informed him in no uncertain terms that, and of course the N word was used in rapid redundancy. At which point, Major Taylor simply rode around them and paced them all the way back to Savannah. And that's how powerful this young man was at the time. And certainly the peak of his career. He would have been about 19 or 20 years old back then. And as not more than a few hours after he arrived back at his rooming house, all of this is detailed in the book, a note attached to a rock came sailing through the bay window of his rooming house, and it told Major Taylor and his trainer that they needed to be out of Savannah by sundown. And that was a threat that he did not take lightly. When he contacted his manager, back east by telegram, he was told to catch the first freighter or the first commercial, pardon me, the first
Train.
boat out of Savannah
Wow.
immediately. So he did. And I will tell you that he never again crossed the Mason-Dixon line
Mm.
after that. Sydney told me that one. And for good reason. He didn't trust, even though his grandparents were slaves in Kentucky, he didn't dare travel even down that far because he really feared for his life. Bottom line, he feared for his life.
For
So,
sure.
I think it's important to point out that the closest he came to actually surrendering his life came from an East Coast wheelman whose name was Becker, and this is again detailed in my book and all of the biographies for that matter. Um, and he was accosted by this cyclist Becker, and you have to understand that whatever Taylor did, and he may well have been guilty of this, he put he put Becker into the catch fence, or he made it difficult for him to get around because he wanted to qualify. These guys, all of these riders were riding for a paycheck
Yeah.
and a big paycheck. So when Becker couldn't qualify, but fourth place in his heat race, he was he outweighed Mage by 50 or 60 pounds.
Hmm.
He came up behind him on the track, wrenched him off of his bicycle from behind, and throttled him down to the pole line, and probably would have strangled him to death. Major Taylor was out for 15 minutes,
Mm.
and if it hadn't been for the constable with the billy club, he may well have lost his life on that occasion. That was at Taunton, Pennsylvania, the track in Taunton, Pennsylvania, which was a dirt track, by the way.
So even the safest place for him to ride wasn't that safe necessarily.
No, not really. He could have an audience. The closer to the Mason-Dixon line he would go, the more in Indianapolis, frequently the newbie loop, they would see a very, very supportive crowd on one side of the track and rampant booze and an occasional vegetable being pitched at him from any spot on that backstretch. So it really depends on who you talk to, but Taylor had a rough go almost from the very beginning. From his first event, the first race he entered, they didn't want to give him the prize. He won on the basis of a handicap race. It was his first race. He was an absolute prodigy, 14 years old, and in in winning this race on a bike that had a gear that he probably had to turn 150, 60 RPMs on because it was a trick bike. It was the bike he was performing tricks on for his employer, who was Sam Hay. And this was Hay and Willett Cyclery on Bicycle Row in downtown Indianapolis, which today is the financial center of Indianapolis. It was a very well looked after part of the city, and that's where all the bike shops were. How popular was cycling? Well,
Yeah.
it was the I would say but the real connection between the horse and buggy, the train, and the highly personalized transportation of being able to get out there and taste the blue sky and fresh air. And that was totally unique at the time. Nobody could do that. I mean, you could ride a horse and you could ride a horse fast, but you couldn't ride a horse very far, very fast.
Major Taylor too, like I think you mentioned, but he wasn't that big of a guy, right? He was, super athletic and very talented, but in terms of like just physically imposing figure, he wasn't that much of a, you looked at him, you think, the other competitors be like, oh, I can beat him up.
Sydney told me he had small feet. He's about 5'6". Yeah. And I think when you start looking at what he was good at, and he began his cycling journey throwing newspapers like a lot of kids, but that that money went straight back to his family, and they lived on the opposite side of the White River, which used to flood quite frequently, and and the 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 levees um, of the day would frequently be run over. So what what Major Taylor had was um, that I'd say God-given ability to maneuver that bike in um, a quick pattern. Anything that required balance and coordination, he was good at that. And he started doing tricks. I think he was completely self-taught. I don't think anybody of the era knew enough to give him any advice on trick riding. But from that very early beginning, he had the ability to put himself in harm's way and get through it. And there would be times when a third of the riders in the final heat of the night uh, would be riding not to win, but to make damn sure Taylor didn't win. So somehow what he had to do, and he refused teammates. He didn't want any teammates because he believed that the Almighty was his ultimate teammate, and he could do it with the help of God. And he was a staunch believer that God was with him every step of the way, and I applaud that because that was my early motivation as well. And I think when you start looking at what he used to do with the I mean. Uh, he would read his catechism on the train. He would have his Bible with him at all times, and I think that early motivation was all he needed. He promised his mother, literally on her deathbed, that he would never race on the Sabbath, and that decision cost him, well, in today's money, it probably would have been millions
Yeah.
because that was the time that eh, in Europe, they went to the opera on Saturday, they went to the bike races on Sunday. In America, it was a little different. They would race on Saturday and Sunday, but more of the races were on Saturday. Uh, but it became difficult for him to compete here because they had stacked the deck so much, and he much preferred pace racing. And keep in mind that we are talking about the evolution of the motorcycle now, the motorcycle and the automobile. And there are so many inventions, beginning, of course, with the pneumatic tire, John Boyd Dunlop's invention of the pneumatic tire, which changed everything. So, bicycles in that invention happened in 1888. By 1892, virtually all of the bicycles and the early motorcycles were running on pneumatic rubber. Well, other things that were important were the things like not too many people know this, that the spiral bevel gear, which became a scaled up version of on the automobile. I think Henry Ford had one of the who was absolutely an avid cyclist, scaled up one of the Sager drives. The Sager was the drive that Major Taylor raced on. And for a while, he was winning time trials and pace racing uh, on the Sager system, which was again a spiral bevel gear. And the only problem was it didn't have the ability to change gears. It was just a shaft drive basically that ran back to the some internal cogs on the wheel. And those became, well, BMW picked up on that, the shaft drive for the BMW motorcycles, and then just it's a elaboration of several different inventions that became the differential, certainly on the Model A, and then every other vehicle after that used an adaptation of it. So that's a couple of things that were important that came about from the early bicycles. So what we have is a developing motorcycle. Then so pacing, we went from the period of human pace where they would run tandems, triplets, quads, quints to get more and more speed, but they still weren't fast enough. As fast as they could go, they still weren't quick enough. And keep in mind, we're talking about the NASCAR of the day because the invention of the motorcycle they would typically use something. I have one in my collection, something like a Orient pacing tandem would be the ideal because that was a sturdy bike. They would hang a small single cylinder Didion Berton motor, French motor, in the rear triangle, and the stoker would operate the motor. That was his job, keep that motor running, and the captain would steer the bike. And they became faster and faster and faster, and Taylor's records kept being broken, and he'd go back and break them again. 7 world records at one point. He held 7 pace records. And as I was starting to say, unlike the mass start competition, which always put him at odds with people that didn't want to see him win, in pacing, it was a sit on that motor and go absolutely as fast as you can. And he had the ability to crank 200 revolutions around the terms of RPMs. It was probably as many as anybody could turn at the time. His real talent was his white fiber, his fast twitch muscle fiber that allowed him to go absolutely ballistic. And when other riders were using bigger gears, he always chose the smaller. And of course, we don't have any film of Major Taylor racing, but I can just imagine how quick his legs must have been turning on one of those bikes at the time.
So when he was in Europe, didn't they even sometimes change the race schedule a little bit so he wouldn't have to race on Sundays so that they could see him?
Yes, they did. Thank you for adding that. What Taylor was originally offered a contract that included quite a lot of money. It would have been probably $250,000 in today's money to race on Sunday. He had to race on Sunday. Well, that just wasn't part of his makeup. And he informed Victor Briere that he would not, who was the French promoter who was bringing him over, that he wouldn't do that. He just wouldn't do it, period. Forget it. So they said, well, we'll have to offer you less money, but we can make it happen. And of course, about almost a year went by and before they finally got Major Taylor. But the the crowds in Europe were so hungry to see this man. They called him the Negro Volant. The fast Negro was his nickname. Over here, it was the Black Cyclone, and that's why we chose the name of the book, by the way. But in Europe, he finally signed the contract that took him there for considerably less money, but he had a higher gate, so he was making more money. And the early races were tough because it was a long cruise across the Atlantic, and um, I think, according to Sydney, he had several really rough times when the waters were very rough, and he got sick a lot. Um, and I don't know if he was ever able to ride his rollers, which of course would have been the trainer of the day. Uh, but when he arrived, it took him quite a while to get rid of those sea legs and start performing. And one of the early races that he did compete in was against the French and at the time world champion um, uh, Edmond Jacquelin. And Jacquelin was um, a hockey guy. He had convinced the whole of Europe that he was the best cyclist, and he believed that completely. And he actually defeated Major Taylor in his first, beat him two straight in his first match, and it was very early. It was cold. It was miserable conditions. The Parc du Princes Velodrome, and he didn't outmaneuver Taylor, but he certainly beat him handily when it came to raw speed. And make no mistake about it, he was an awesome cyclist and had tree-trunk legs, as Major Taylor described it. And when when they met again, it was a very, very different story because at that point he had warmed. The weather had gotten much warmer, and he had raced at every one of the champions of Europe and had not necessarily beaten them outright, but over the course of several tours of Europe, he actually did beat every single one of the champions of Europe in every country except for the UK. He never made it to England.
Hmm.
But I think the story of how he beat Jacqueline in the second. I'm going to reserve that for the book, but that's really the highlight of the feature film that we're trying to produce at this point. And we have several strong leads we're pursuing, and I'd like to add that we have a wonderful screenplay written by Bob Isley, who has wrote the screenplay for the Ray Charles story, and also that wonderful. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. The Denzel Washington film called The Great Debaters. I think Denzel won an Academy Award for that one. But in addition to that, we have Clement Virgo, who is a 10-time Canadian Academy Award winner, who just completed a film called Brother. So we've got a wonderful director. We've got a world-class team. Kevin DeWalt, Mind's Eye Entertainment. That's our production company. So we've got all the pieces in place. Just trying to secure the rest of the funding, and that's that event that I described where we're up against the best of Europe. Edmond Jacquelin will be certainly an important part of the film because it's sort of the culmination of where Major Taylor went with his career. And he actually had quite a long career, more than 10 years at the top of the sport where, uh, yeah, just understand it from the perspective of if you were racing, you couldn't stay in a hotel because they wouldn't let you.
Mhm.
You couldn't eat with the other riders. You couldn't dine in a restaurant. You were restricted on all fronts, basically.
Over
That's
in Europe, he was able to integrate more into society though than he was here, right?
absolutely, yes. He was extremely well respected in Europe, any place he went. And there were examples where that wasn't the case, but by and large, he was both respected and actually revered in Europe. So, yes, I I think it's safe to say that both Europe and Australia were some of the highlights of his career because he could race freely against mano a mano against these top racers without the racial animosity that drug him down constantly.
And here too, the national championships in his day too wasn't a single race, right? Wasn't it a series of races that you had to do well, and then if you did well over the series, you were the national champion? Isn't that how it worked in America then?
It had a different format. There were several organizations, of course, including the League of American Wheelmen, who oscillated back and forth on how these championship races would be run. Um, Generally, yes, you had to qualify, and to qualify, you had to make it to the final. Uh, and that's how the pack was whittled down. Uh, the national championship series was just that. It was a series, and it had a lot to do with attending as many of these races as possible. Taylor had an advantage because he did win more of them than any other of the riders of the time, in spite of the obstacles he had to face. But there were events, again, where the racial card was drawn. St. Louis, a good example. We're down to the finals, 1898, I believe it was, and um, the rain had caused postponements, and of course the general consensus was, well, we'll hold the race on Sunday, only day, and Taylor said, no, I won't do it. So he gave up points in St. Louis, and then the following week was another event in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, for a little further south, more my territory in Missouri, where I'm from. Uh, but Cape Girardeau had uh, a, a, a promoter. I'm trying to remember his name. I think it was Dunlop, and Mr. Dunlop told him that he would be treated fairly in Cape Girardeau. He would have an opportunity to spend a night in a hotel, and he would be able to dine in the hotel restaurant, which he assumed was the case. But when he got to Cape Girardeau, Dunlop was singing a different tune, and he said, "I'm sorry, Major, but the riders universally will not allow you to stay in their hotel, the hotel where they're." And he said, "It's not their call." And he said, "You gave me, Major Taylor was a strong believer in if you gave him your word, you would honor that." And not only could he not stay in the hotel, but he would be forced to find accommodations with other African American families somewhere, which hadn't even been prearranged. So he just said, "Nope, I won't do it. I'm going back to Worcester." And he said, "Pack the bags. We're headed back east." And he did. He gave up 2 events that would have cemented the title, and it isn't clear, whether he got that title or not. The uh, other competitor of the day who he went up against continually, Eddie Bald, had another engagement that took him out of bicycle racing altogether. Uh, on off Broadway, he wanted to be an actor. Bottom line, he wanted to be an actor more than he wanted to be a cyclist. So he gave up the same opportunity. So it's not clear whether Taylor won that. I don't think he did. I think it was another year before he finally got the American championship. But that would have been 1898, and then 1899 uh, in Montreal. He actually went up in the 2 mile event, I believe it was, and he believed strongly that he had won the race, but the officials called it differently, and all the crowd was just appalled that they would give it to his competitor because he clearly won the race. So, but it didn't phase him. He knew he could do it again. He was so powerful. He went out and he won the mile race, and this time it was convincingly. So that was his world title, the 1 mile championship in Montreal. So that was his world title. I think he would have won a lot more events if he had had a fair deal, but it became increasingly difficult for him. And if he couldn't ride pace racing and set world records, he knew he had to go to Europe, and about the same time offers started coming in from Australia as well.
You
So
wrote this
John,
book from a different perspective. You didn't. It's not like a telling of a story necessarily just straight out, but you're telling it through Josh Owens' perspective. Tell us.
Exactly. Josh Owens is fictional, but he so resembles the character of Dan Southard, who actually was part of the Southard family. Let me explain that. The Southards were a wealthy railroad family, uh, and Mr. Southard worked for one of the. I sorry, I don't recall the name of the railroad, but I will have that information. I can pull it up. Uh, but at any rate, they had a beautiful house on South Meridian Drive, which was the upscale part of Indianapolis, and that's uh, especially important because during a period where Taylor, Gilbert Taylor, Major Taylor's father, was at a horse show, and a blaze inside a closed arena took place. And of course, the horses started to stampede, and he calmly calmed the horses and at the same time dumped a bucket of water on the fire to put it out. Well, at that point, Mr. Southard hired Gilbert Taylor on the spot. Gilbert Taylor was a Union veteran who was wounded in the Civil War, and he was, like his son. He was, he came from this hardworking background, so he became the coachman for the Southard family, and they asked Major Taylor because the Southards had a son of just the same age, about 8 or 10 years old. I'd say 9 years old would have been the time that they actually met. And they became great friends. And Dan Southard and Taylor had some other experiences that I will leave to the book,
Right.
namely the YMCA incident.
Sure.
But after a period of time, they realized that it was important to have a decent education. And during the time that Major was there at the Southern's home, he received a tutored education from an Ivy League scholar, and that made all the difference. And this particular tutor uh, decided early on that it was important for these kids, and there were about 4 of them that were educated there at the Southern house, to have um, what they wanted to do. And in the case of Taylor, it was engineering. He was very much interested in becoming an engineer. In the case of some of the other kids, it might have been literature, it might have been whatever it was. Uh, they would be encouraged to pursue something that they were vitally interested in, and that made all the difference as far as teaching them, and that was the form of education that worked well for Major Taylor. He spoke the King's English. He had an understanding of math and all of the I don't know how far up the ladder he went, because he didn't have a lot of time, a year and a half maybe. But during that year and a half, he learned a great deal. I will tell you that. And it was a practical education, and it helped him further along when he did try to get into the Worcester Polytech Institute engineering school later on after his retirement. That never happened, but again, I'll leave that to the book. But
Sure.
what I think is important is that he did get that education, and that really helped him further along. And in spite of all the obstacles that he faced, I think it's safe to say he was the best dressed of
Mm.
all of the athletes on the cycling circuit. Uh, he took great pride in his appearance, and in spite of all the obstacles he had to deal with, it was important for him to present himself, and in many cases present his case. And because there were times when they just flat wouldn't let him race. Um, the League of American Wheelmen had an ongoing debate here that cyclists, white only, was part of the entry form. You couldn't race if you were black. That simple. Blacks of the era were simply not allowed to play.
Well, John, could you back up just a little bit? You grew up in the 50s as a young boy, right? You were in the 50s. How did you get into cycling yourself, and how did you make that connection with Major Taylor, which was, at the top of his game 50 years, prior to that?
Well, I didn't start out reading about Major Taylor. I had no idea he even existed. I went into a Schwinn bicycle store, old school bicycle store with creaky hardwood floors and a high ceiling, metal ceiling. A and B Cycle, Walnut Street in Springfield, Missouri. I went in there to get a repair made on my bike. This was, I don't know how old I was. My parents were with me. And my brother and I were really starting to get interested in cycling. But on that showcase, glass showcase, you can visualize that, was a comic book. It was put out by the Arnold Schwinn Company, and it featured one of the best 6-day racers of all time, Alf Latournier, who changed his name to Laturner over here. He was a expatriate Frenchman, came here and contacted the Schwinn Bicycle Company because of his fame and his acclaim in Europe. They decided that they would go after Charlie Murphy's 60-mile-per-hour record. Mile a minute Murphy back in 1899 went about 61 miles an hour behind the Long Island Express train. And Murphy and Taylor did vaudeville together. They did roller racing together. But way before that, it was that record that Alf Latourner was going after. He wanted to break it. He knew he could break it, and Schwinn came through with a hand-made, actually built him 3 bikes, Schwinn Paramounts that had small front wheels, straight forks, and massive, massive chain rings. And he knew that's the traditional way from motor pacing. Well, he didn't even, I think he wore a helmet, but no protection at all other than the helmet, maybe gloves. And he did break it. He went 108 miles an hour. And I was just fascinated by that. And I determined right then and there I was going to be a bike racer. And I eventually, when I had some capital behind me, I would break that record. Well, it got broken again and again after that. It was broken by another Frenchman. Let me think. That would have been, boy, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden. Anyway, a Frenchman broke Latourner's record, went 127 miles an hour, nearly died. Shoot, I'm drawing a blank. At any rate, he broke the record, and he passed the torch to someone that I have a huge amount of respect for, who actually set the record at 139 miles an hour. Suddenly I'm going blank on names, but I will remember them eventually. So this is what happens when you're 77 years old. But at any rate, I think it's really significant to say that that record has been broken, I think, 9 times since 1899, and it was broken most recently by someone I coached, Denise Mueller, who went 183 miles an hour behind a rail dragster that we built for her. So that's the current speed record, 183 miles an hour. But that it didn't just suddenly happen, and at this point it's life-threatening. But I think, I don't know where I was going with that, other than tell you that that's how I got my career off the ground. And I started racing because you need credibility, and you're not going to get it through going after speed records that are paced anymore. You've got to be able to win races and win them consistently. So, yeah, I've been very lucky. I've won 19 national championships in elite and masters racing. As you said, held records at both ends of the spectrum of madness, and I like that. And I'd say that if everything being equal, it makes for a great story. But I think I was destined to be a paced racer all along. I think, all the events that I have been very fortunate to win. I was always looking for that 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 pace car. And yeah, um, in 1897, 1898, it was incredibly dangerous because chains would break and all kinds of things could go wrong. And, Peter Nye and his Albert Champion book, talked about, the dangers of paced racing where, on occasion, I think it's happened more than once, spectators, pacers, and and cyclists were gave up their lives at the velodrome. So unbelievably dangerous period in sports history. Uh, but it's why people went to the track. They wanted to see this kind of mayhem, and it attracted a large number of people, so much so that um, they paid the cyclists very well. But baseball was gaining steam. But even as late as 1912, I would point out that Major Taylor had made almost 10 times more money than Ty Cobb, who was let's see, Ty Cobb was a Detroit Tigers star player back in that era, but baseball players still didn't make a lot of money. Taylor made tens of thousands of money, and of course would have made a lot more if he had chosen to race on the Sabbath, but that wasn't part of his makeup. And he was true to his cause. He believed strongly that that was an important, very important part of his creed, if you will.
And probably if he was white too, even if not even racing on Sundays too, but if he was white, he probably would have been afforded more opportunities and maybe paid higher salaries too.
Oh, sure, sure, yeah. But the this I often say that cycling was popular in that era for all the wrong reasons,
Mm.
and the uh, death and destruction that occurred on the tracks when chains would break or tires would blow and people died, was partly because the tracks were too small to handle the speed that they were traveling. So tracks got bigger, and finally they dumped the bicyclists altogether. And but I think it's an important fact, that a lot of those early bicycle racers, if you look at the 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 ledgers of who was actually racing, nobody nobody but the bicycle racers were brave enough to attempt pacing behind a motorcycle at 60 miles an hour or more. Uh, and and the pacing motorcycles eventually gave way to the steaming motor cars. And again, guys like Barney Oldfield, who could no longer make it as a bicycle racer, became Henry Ford's chief test driver and set records in the early Ford 999, which was Henry Ford's first race car. In the early days, Ford only wanted to race. That was his calling. He wanted to have the fastest cars in the world, and of course, eventually that would change. But Ford Motor Company was bankrolled by Tom Cooper's money. Most of the money came from the early money that started the company came from the the racing fortunes of Tom Cooper, who parlayed that first into cement. And many of the roads of Detroit are paved with Cooper's cement.
Hmm.
And he also bankrolled Henry Ford. So Um, it just goes on and on, guys. When the more I talk, the more I start thinking about all of these
Sure.
connections, and they're all connected in some way. And the automobile and the motorcycle certainly should pay homage to the lowly bicycle because that's how it all started, all of those inventions. And, I so wanted to tell those stories. I didn't really tell that many of them in the Black Cyclone, but I think there's enough to wet your whistle. That's for certain. And all of it is, it's all lore and you know, it was a rough and tumble era. Um, and I wish I could think of more names of some of these people that I'm sure you've heard of. It's just um, my memory banks are flooded with details. Some I remember, some I don't.
Sure, John. Well, we appreciate you taking so much time with us today, giving us some insight into this work, Major Taylor book, The Black Cyclone. That yeah, I'm reading chapter 8, I think, right now, and yeah, it's hard to put down. It's fascinating. It's a great read, and I'm looking forward to finishing off. But um, we'll put on some links on our website and from the podcast notes about where you can get your hands on this book, because it's available
think
Amazon and some other places.
you can get it on Amazon. I'm happy to say it's an Amazon bestseller. We're not as strong yet in Barnes and Noble, which is another place you can get them. You can buy it from Dorrance Direct, the publisher, or you can click on our website and purchase it there. The website is majortaylorstory.com. And you'll see some wonderful period photographs that aren't in the book on the website. Some of those photos were gifted to me by Sydney Taylor Brown, and I'm grateful to her for supplying me with many photos that she had slides made of that did find their way into the book. So when you get on there, I think you'll be those of you especially interested in history will find some additional details not included in the book uh, in the on the website. So please, that's the way you can order it there as well.
All right. Yeah, we'll be sure to put that link in our podcast notes and on the One Cycling Podcast website as well. So
Yeah, I mean, he's a Major Taylor too. Is spawned. I know you worked with the Major Taylor Cycling Club in was it Massachusetts or New Jersey? Where was it that you worked with them?
Yes. I'm sorry, I missed the
Oh,
I'm in addition to being deaf, go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, I was
Go
just saying
ahead,
that
Randy.
he's spawned. I mean, so I've done some work with SRAM where we work on welcoming, encouraging cycling groups and stuff too. And Major Taylor is, there's Major Taylor clubs all around the country. And a
Yes.
lot of times I talk to the people that are in those clubs and they don't even know the history of Major Taylor. So they know that he was a great black cyclist at some point in time. But this kind of thing too is just going to be more than informing people about, what a great cyclist he was and all what he had to overcome to be that good cyclist and stuff too. But it's a great way. And like I was saying earlier, the read itself, coming from the Josh Owen perspective, like it's being told by this person too, is a much more interesting read. And like Dean was saying, it's more of a page turner, I think, than some of the other books have been written by him too, because it's a story too. It's not just facts being put out there and telling what happened to him, but in a story format. So it's a real interesting read.
Yes, you're right. There are over 250 Major Taylor clubs worldwide, and the primary source there is my good friend Lynn Tolman with the Major Taylor um, Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. So uh, Lynn is every bit as much of a historian as I am, and also Peter Nye, who's written great stories about Major Taylor, and his latest book is the Albert Champion story. I highly recommend that one too. Um, yeah, so we're all trying to promote Major Taylor, and uh, he was, of course, the first acclaimed African American athlete, and far more than that, and we haven't even touched on it. He was a pioneer in civil rights movements after his retirement. And just briefly, I will touch on that. One of his good friends was W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the founder of the Crisis magazine and also the NAACP. Um, uh, Du Bois was a little more edge playing than some of the other African American leaders of the time, including Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute for higher learning for African Americans at the time. Um, yes, it's all, an important saga in the history of sports history, as well as the very rudimentary beginnings of the civil rights movement, which of course didn't really get fired up until the 60s.
Mhm.
So way, way after Major Taylor, who of course died in 1932. So um, he campaigned strongly for equal rights in sports and in life in general. And for that, I applaud him. And there's a wonderful there is a great documentary film out there called Major Taylor, Champion of Race. Todd Gould put that out, Indiana University. That's something that is available on demand. And if anyone interested in more information can go to that link and check that one out.
Yeah. Well, good luck too in getting your movie produced too, because it sounds like that could be quite a production, and be great to get that out, because as much as we like to read, and I listen to a lot of audiobooks too, it's you get a movie out there and it gets even more exposure.
Exactly. We're on it. My book, finally, and I appreciate everything, Randy and Dean. I'm available on hard copy, hard cover book, soft cover, ebook, and now finally Audible. So all formats are covered.
Excellent. Yeah.
Very good. All right. Thanks so much, John. We appreciate you taking the time and wow, sharing with us your vast knowledge of the history, not just of Major Taylor, but all of that era as well.
I'm a student of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Whew, so much history, so much. I mean, whew, we can't even recap it. I mean,
Yeah, John. Yeah, John's a legend. It was interesting because
yeah,
he was saying that when we saw the information about the book and stuff, they said John Kennedy Howard a lot, and we just know him in cycling world as John Howard. But I mean, he's a little bit older than we are, but he was, in the time frame when he was at his peak before we were really following cycling that much. But he was, a really good cyclist in a lot of different ways, and certainly was one of the founders of RAM and Ultra Endurance, as well as things and stuff too. So
yeah, well, even Ironman too.
yeah, right. Exactly.
Ironman champion, right?
Yeah. So he's always been a name that most cyclists will recognize if they've been following the sport very long at all.
For sure. Well, we've run way past what we normally do time wise.
Yeah.
I thought we'd recap a little of what was going on elsewhere, but probably say that for another podcast maybe.
Maybe we should do another one. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Birthdays though, should we do birthdays today?
We might as well, right? Because then when we broadcast again later, it'll be a different day. So it's always good to recognize whose birthdays it is.
On December the 13th, which is this year, it's a Friday the 13th, which
Friday the 13th
might mean something to some people, but it's just another Friday, another 13th. Oh, look at that. Well, let's see. Yeah, we're still in the same day because we always have to check our list comes from Europe, which could change over after 6 p.m. Eastern time for us. We're recording a little bit before that now, though. And Mikel Landa is still active rider who's really
He had a great
well,
year this year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he did. He's got almost 3 times as much as the next rider, who is Biganu Spruch. It's like a Polish rider, was 59 today, but
It was only
Mikael Landis
59, yeah.
35, and he's still active, and he's still he signed with Sugal Quickstep through 2025.
He is a
So
key
he's got at least
lieutenant for
another year.
Evanpool. Yeah, I mean Evanpool, when they were looking for a climber that would help him, possibly win the Grand Tours, they signed Mikael Landa. So yeah, it was a huge signing for them.
Yeah, scan down the list, not too many other familiar names, or nobody really old except for this looks like a Portuguese rider who would be 110,
Yeah,
Ildefonso Rodriguez.
yeah.
So he won a bunch of stages at the 22 stages at the Volta of Portugal. So back, he was born back in 1914, so a little bit after Major Taylor's time. But
Yeah.
Amanda Miller's 38. Amanda
Yeah.
Miller, she was both road and cyclocross racer.
Big time trialist. Yeah. So
Yeah. Happy birthday, Amanda. Anyone else? Americans?
Megan Long.
Teeth.
Yeah, she's 40 years old today, Megan Long.
All right, Megan, happy birthday. All right. Well, let's wrap it up, because I don't know. Hopefully, like a long podcast, you'll just stop it and pick it up later, and don't expect you to listen to this whole time. But
Never know. Might be on a long ride. George Christensen, my friend, who unfortunately passed away this year, he used to listen to our podcast on the bike sometimes. So he would just, you guys
Keep
just
riding.
Yeah, listen to what we're saying. So he would ride all day long. So he could get through several of them.
all right. Thanks, Randy. We'll catch up with you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Dean.
All right, bye.